Right, my friends, buckle up because I, Gareth Morgan, am about to take you on a brand new WhatCulture ride. In this series, we're going to be diving into the backstage world of pro wrestling, unpacking stories about some of the most important and shocking moments in the history of this great business. And with WrestleMania right around the corner, it seems like a good time to take a closer look at how WrestleMania actually almost killed WWE. Yeah, that's right. So I'm Gareth, you are watching WhatCulture Wrestling, and, well, let's get to it. So in the grand mythology of contemporary mainstream professional wrestling, WrestleMania is painted as the definitive game changer. The pivot point, if you will, that transformed the industry from a regional circus into a global entertainment powerhouse. WWE's revisionist history treats the inaugural event as an inevitable success that the world was watching, and indeed the one that the business was waiting for. And if you've seen one glittery highlight package, well, you've seen them all and you know the beats. The first WrestleMania was a glowing, showbiz and star-studded triumph where Vince McMahon's enterprising gamble paid off and the world changed forever. With sports entertainment immediately defined as the genre of wrestling strong enough to tear up the territories and own the conversation then, now, and forever. The truth, as is always the case in wrestling, is a little more complicated and thus often neglected. The reality of WrestleMania 1 is not just that it was a success, but that it had to be a success, folks. I mean, if it had failed, it might have taken WWE down with it. Or at least McMahon's vision of what he wanted WWE to be. Long before WrestleMania made the likes of Las Vegas, Nevada, or even the slightly less glamorous Atlantic City, New Jersey, its home, the show of shows was a high-stakes roll of the dice where a lower number didn't mean losing a game. It meant game over, as Miro would say. At the end of the first show's main event, the game looked won. Hulk Hogan and Mr. T embraced to the cheers of thousands of New Yorkers in a wired Madison Square Garden, creating a shot that defined what made the event special. It was, however, the result of more luck and chance than it looked, and piled the pressure on for the recognized leader in sports entertainment to do it over and over and over again for eternity. 41 and counting right now. The template was now in place and almost everything had been leveraged to make it so. Before we really dive into all this, and while on the subject of Mania and, well, killing things, I want to ask a quick question. What match do you think almost killed the Mania or just ruined it altogether? Let me know in the comments down below. I am curious. Right, back to the video. So, before WrestleMania, WWE was in something of a dangerous position. Vince McMahon had set his sights on national expansion, and unlike his father, who broadly played within the unwritten rules of the old wrestling territories, he was ready to burn the rulebook, set it all on fire. He raided the biggest stars from other promotions. He rapidly set about attempting to dominate cable television by any available means, and poured any and all resources into a larger-than-life vision of wrestling as well-packaged mainstream entertainment rather than, regional athletic sporting theatre. But his dreams were costing him an absolute bloody fortune. The company's aggressive expansion, including lucrative deals with Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, and other emerging megastars, and megastars-to-be, meant expenses were skyrocketing. Vince had broken away from the traditional systems in search of bigger profits than any of the established methods could offer, but in doing so was on the verge of not securing enough accumulation for all of his speculation. When he'd purchased the company around 2 years earlier, it was still largely a regional operation based in the Northeast. There were financially lucrative strongholds in New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, sure, but it was still just one piece of a fractured wrestling landscape controlled by the National Wrestling Alliance, and could generally be costed for accordingly. McMahon's goals broke molds, but they broke the bank too. He needed more TV to make money, but needed more stars to get more TV, but he needed more TV to make money, and just on and on it went. It just kept going in circles. That's where we were. WrestleMania, or at very least the idea of a show of such scale, stood to be the one thing that could draw all three components together at the same time. But a potentially magic fix couldn't be created simply with the wave of a magic wand. To make money and make the show a reality, McMahon was going to have to start making enemies. I'm sure he found that tough. Again, with each territory having its own top stars, champions, and television deals, wrestling promoters could operate under an unwritten code of honor because nobody's business suffered. Wrestlers could get stale and move around, repeat cycles, draw money, and keep towns in decent health. Look, it wasn't perfect, nor was it always as easy a formula as that process that I just mentioned suggests. But a touring world champion was never short of a hot town or challenger across any of the 50 states for the decades preceding WrestleMania. Vince McMahon Jr. was prepared to shatter all of that for his own gains, though. And we're not talking about those kind of gains. No, we're talking about them ones. Predictably, this didn't sit remotely well with the long-established promoters who had their own regional empires. These men, the likes of Vern Gagne, Jim Crockett, and others, were not just competitors now. They were personal and professional enemies with a vested interest in seeing McMahon fail. They wanted to see him fall flat on his face. And for a while, failure seemed inevitable. Because getting national syndication was a near impossible job, McMahon could fall at the first hurdle. He'd even potentially wipe himself out before paying his father back, they'd reckon. Or at very least not make it past the first year or so of being in business under his own steam. What could he possibly know or do that they didn't or hadn't, eh? Well, more than they could have accounted for, as it turned out. McMahon secured deals for WWE programming on cable television nationally. With more exposure, he could now go after the biggest stars in wrestling and offer them the kind of money and opportunity they just couldn't refuse, even if it meant leaving behind a system that might have previously served them pretty well. The biggest and inarguably most important name to take the deal was a bloke you may have heard of by the name of Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan had become a breakout star thanks to his role in Rocky III as Thunderlips, a larger-than-life wrestling heel who battled Sylvester Stallone's Rocky Balboa. I bloody love that movie, baby. At the time, Hogan was working for Vern Gagne's AWA, but Vince saw him as the perfect centerpiece for his vision of WWF. So he lured Hogan away in late 1983, and by early 1984, Hogan was crowned WWF champion after defeating the Iron Sheik at Madison Square Garden. The Iron Sheik's title reign was short-lived, orchestrated specifically to set up Hogan's triumph, as Bob Backlund's reign, and with it the image of a company McMahon no longer needed hanging around, hurriedly disappeared from view. With Hogan as champion, Jr. now had his own golden goose with massive biceps. The strategy was clear. Build the company around Hulk Hogan's larger-than-life charisma and position him as a superhero for a national audience. And the timing was perfect. The 1980s were an era of excess where flamboyant personalities and patriotic themes resonated with mainstream America. Hogan fit that mold perfectly with his chiseled physique, boundless energy, and his iconic rallying cry of train, say your prayers, take your vitamins. Not gonna ask what vitamins they were, but just listen to Hogan. But McMahon knew that a single star was not enough, folks. He needed a roster filled with characters that felt ripped from the same silver screen the artist formerly known as Thunderlips had emerged from. He assembled a cast of villains and heroes that were tailor-made for TV. Roddy Piper, a world-class trash talker that had drawn money and acclaim everywhere he'd been, became Hogan's perfect foil. Mr. Wonderful, Paul Orndorff, a jacked heel as egotistical as his name suggested, was another major acquisition. And then there were legends like Andre the Giant, who brought credibility and spectacle wherever he appeared, and was packaged as somebody as homegrown as Vince Jr. himself. With his roster now in place, Vince pushed forward with a bold expansion plan. Ignoring calls to stay in his lane, he struck more deals to air WWE programming in markets controlled by rival promotions. Effectively invading enemy territory is what he was doing. He aggressively sought out pay-per-view and closed-circuit television opportunities, recognizing that the future of wrestling profitability lay in large-scale supercards such as the yet-to-be-christened Grandest Stage. But the territory promoters fought back, baby. Vern Gagne tried to lure Hogan back to the AWA, even offering him a percentage of the company. But Hogan stayed loyal to Vince, didn't he? Jim Crockett Jr., who controlled the powerful Mid-Atlantic territory, pushed back by trying to dominate the emerging pay-per-view market before McMahon got there. Other promoters, including Bill Watts of Mid-South Wrestling and Fritz Von Erich of World Class Championship Wrestling, saw their talent being poached and their business eroding under Vince's aggressive tactics, but remained steadfast that their talent and creativity could outlast his bombastic and marketing-heavy promotion. Not for the first time in the story, though, they would end up on the wrong side of this slice of wrestling history. Despite all these successes, WWE was hemorrhaging money by early 1985. The costs of the national expansion strategy mounted up, and convincing the public that wrestling could stand shoulder to shoulder with the biggest sports and entertainment properties in America wasn't exactly getting any cheaper. WWF was spending more than it was bringing in, simple as that. And Vince and Linda McMahon had leveraged everything, including personal finances, on the belief that wrestling could go mainstream on a national and global level. It was time to pull the trigger on something that would make all the financial risks pay off in one night. A true game changer. And that game changer was called the Colossal Tussle. I mean, it wasn't. It very nearly was, but it wasn't. It was actually called WrestleMania. Whatever perfect was or is, WrestleMania had to be it. It had to be perfect. Absolutely perfect. It had to be a sellout. It had to be a massive success on closed-circuit television. This was an early form of pay-per-view where fans could watch the events in theaters and arenas across the country. And yeah, that is actually as cool as it sounds. I did that once for a WWE pay-per-view years ago in a cinema, and I had a great time. It also had to prove that wrestling wasn't just regional entertainment, but mainstream spectacle. And it had to make those that had gambled on it come back for more. Vince McMahon didn't just invest WWE's money into WrestleMania as well. He invested, well, everything. Every available resource went into making the show look as big as humanly possible. If WrestleMania failed, there was no backup plan. There was no plan B. The death or glory nature seemed to inspire the biggest and boldest strides. And as was so often the case in McMahon's career, required as much luck as judgment. WWE needed to feel like it formed part of the pop culture landscape. And this was where MTV came in. The early 1980s was a golden era for the network, having launched in 1981 and almost immediately revolutionizing music through the advent of music television. Music videos became cultural milestones, and MTV was defining what was cool for an entire generation. It's like what we at WhatCulture do for the current generation. Yeah, right. McMahon saw an opportunity and took a big ol' swing. He convinced pop star Cyndi Lauper to get involved with wrestling. Lauper and her manager David Wolf became entangled in a storyline with Lou Albano, leading to the brawl to end it all on MTV in 1984, where Wendy Richter defeated the Fabulous Moolah for the WWF Women's Championship to end a kayfabe 26-year title reign. The event pulled incredible ratings, leading to a follow-up which was called The War to Settle the Score. Not sure where they were going there. Which further cemented wrestling's presence on MTV and helped set the stage for WrestleMania thanks to Piper and Hogan's ongoing rivalry dominating the numbers and the conversation. Both events took place at Madison Square Garden, establishing the Manhattan venue to the new audience as the destination for the action they had now taken more than a passing interest in. Madison Square Garden wasn't just another arena, was it? It was the arena. The Garden had long been the mecca of professional wrestling, hosting legendary matches and sellout crowds. But more importantly now, it was a media hub. Getting mainstream coverage of an increasingly mainstream product required New York-based newspapers, television stations, and magazines to care. So the location was perfect not only for its wrestling history, but for its proximity to these major entertainment outlets. And with NBC and MTV headquartered there, celebrities and press would have easy access to the event, making it feel even more significant and just massive. The overlap effect was working too. Hogan and Richter were suddenly considered on the level of Lauper by the wider public. And when A-Team megastar Mr. T found himself folded into the Hulkster's rivalry with Roddy Piper, WWE was suddenly at the center of a cultural earthquake that it had smartly manufactured. It was seeming all a bit too good to be true, really, but the context of what brought the McMahons to this point is very important. The high-risk, high-reward method was, to Vince at very least, a smoother road than some of the others he'd previously taken. It would have been one thing to lose company money on something as big as WrestleMania. It would have been quite another to see your family's entire personal finances disappear. The McMahons invested their own money, took out loans, and allegedly put their home on the line in order to see it through. And the numbers, they needed to add up. The company's financial survival depended on ticket sales and closed-circuit revenue. And Linda, often seen as the revised, business-minded half of the duo, was just as much in the trenches as her now estranged husband. She worked behind the scenes, ensuring the finances added up, handling endless logistical headaches, and keeping the books somewhat balanced while Vince focused on the big picture. Let me put it this way, had WrestleMania failed and just not worked at all, just all went up in flames, it was terrible, WWE would not only have gone bankrupt, but the McMahons themselves would have been completely ruined. But McMahon was too busy trying to see through a lifelong dream. Alright, so let's dive into that life a little bit, shall we? Born in 1945 in Pinehurst, North Carolina, Vince's early years were filled with hardship. Junior did not grow up under his father's direct guidance after his parents divorced when he was young, and he was raised by his mother and a string of abusive stepfathers. He didn't actually meet Vince Sr. until he was a teenager, but despite his rough upbringing, he was ambitious. He entered the business working for his father in the 1970s, serving as a promoter and commentator. And early on, he showed the obnoxious and aggressive business style that became his calling card, pushing for expansion when his father preferred to stick to the traditional territorial system. In 1966, Vince married Linda McMahon, his high school sweetheart. The two met as teenagers, and per their own testimonies, their relationship quickly grew into a partnership built on mutual ambition and resilience. Linda was just as invested in their future as Vince, even if she wasn't really that interested in being the public face. She wasn't simply a supportive wife in the background. She was making sure WWE didn't collapse under its own ambitions, as those ambitions only grew larger and more audacious. By 1985, though, the McMahons had to go massive show at Wembley. I mean, they had to go all in. Don't know what happened there, that was weird. They had invested every resource, they'd burned bridges with the old wrestling world, and staked everything on the belief that wrestling could be more than just a niche sport. If WrestleMania failed, there would be no safety net to fall back onto. There was no going back to the territory system they themselves had pillaged. And this was all the more reason why the wrestling establishment wanted it to fail. The traditionalists of the wrestling world, still understandably bitter and concerned about Vince's attempted hostile takeover of their territories, actively rooted for WrestleMania to fail. If it flopped, it would serve as proof that Vince's vision of wrestling as mainstream entertainment was a failure too. There were also whispers that certain wrestlers were actually being bribed to cause disruptions or even no-show. Vince was at war with the old guard, my friends, and the grandest stage was the ultimate battleground. Okay, before we continue, if you are finding this look at how WrestleMania very nearly killed WWE quite interesting, then tap that subscribe button down below for even more of these WhatCulture Wrestling videos every single glorious day. Now back to this video we go. Back within Titan Sports walls ahead of the big show, McMahon was encountering entirely new dilemmas as part of the entirely new world he was trying to occupy. Celebrities were key, but getting celebrities was expensive, and convincing them that wrestling was worth their time also wasn't easy. Mr. T, the key to the main event, almost walked away multiple times, frustrated with the wrestling business and worried about how it would possibly affect his image. And also, Roddy Piper had no intention of letting T make him look bad after legitimate tension developed between the pair. Hell, that very nearly derailed the main event of the mega show. Tension boiled over in heated confrontations during press events, and there was concern that Piper might go off script during the match itself. I mean, can you imagine that? And even when both the wrestlers and the television stars ostensibly had control over situations, things still happened that could have poleaxed everything. During an appearance on Richard Belzer's Hot Property Talk show, Hulk Hogan was asked to demonstrate a wrestling hold on the host. So he put Belzer in a front face lock, and when he released it, Belzer collapsed, hitting his head on the floor and briefly losing consciousness. Oh boy. Yep, blood visibly trickled from his head, and the incident became a minor scandal in the days that followed. Can you imagine if that happened now? It'd be a mega scandal. Meltzer sued, and while the lawsuit was eventually settled, it added another layer of unpredictability and uncertainty to WrestleMania's promotional tour. There was a stroke of good luck too, though. In the final days leading up to WrestleMania, Vince caught an unexpected break when Hogan and Mr. T were drafted in as last-minute hosts of NBC's Saturday Night Live the night before WrestleMania. It was an enormous publicity boost. The slot put Hogan and T in front of millions of viewers in the ideal market at the perfect time. Like, what more can you ask for? It was an unplanned but incredibly fortuitous situation that helped push the show's rising visibility into the damn stratosphere. Though rocky, risky, and not without controversy, the long journey had reached its destination as all the cliches were becoming truisms. The time for talk was over, baby, and WrestleMania now had to deliver on everything that Vince McMahon had promoted and promised. No pressure. March 31st, 1985 was going to be the night that changed everything, regardless of the success or failure of the show. Fortunately for the McMahons, the former looked likely before the first bell even rang. Madison Square Garden was packed and jacked, and thousands more gathered in theaters and arenas across the country to watch on closed-circuit television. The atmosphere was electric, even if there was an understandable sky-high tension behind the scenes. Despite all the potential pitfalls, though, WrestleMania was a triumph. The show combined spectacle, star power, and entertainment in a way that wrestling never had before. The first ever WrestleMania match saw Tito Santana take on the Executioner, played this time by Buddy Rose under the hood. Santana was a popular babyface, coming off a recent run as Intercontinental Champion, and his win was a well-received start to proceedings. One of the shortest matches in WrestleMania history, and an easy talking point from the undercard for WWE to promote came next. King Kong Bundy's squash win over SD Jones was announced as going just 9 seconds, even though in reality it was closer to 23. WWE lying about a record? Well, I never. Its role in establishing Bundy as a main event threat was crucial, though, as he would go on to headline WrestleMania 2. Later on, Andre the Giant slammed Big John Studd to win a gimmicked $15,000 prize in a match featuring 2 more monsters for Hulk Hogan to eventually defeat. Now look, the match doesn't hold up now, but the spectacle of seeing the 2 behemoths collide was exactly what the New York casuals were going to have their eyes widened by. David Sammartino's stinker with Brutus Beefcake was only there for those who'd been in the garden all along to tell the newbies about David's da. You know, Big Bruno. And look, the likes of Ricky Steamboat, Junkyard Dog, and the US Express were better wrestling babyfaces than the breakout stars the McMahons needed in that moment, but all played their part in between the biggest headlines. One of which was the crowning of Wendy Richter as women's champion, with victory over Leilani Kai alongside semi-regular star Cyndi Lauper. The match was heavily tied into the phenomenally successful Rock and Wrestling connection, with Cyndi Lauper's presence and the MTV ties continuing to provide monster dividends. And at this point, Richter was positioned as the female counterpart to Hulk Hogan, a neon crossover star in the making. The match itself wasn't technically great, but the crowd were, and the presentation of the finish soared as a result. The challenger won with a roll-up, reclaiming the belt in a moment that would have been more significant in the years to come had Richter's run not ended in a money disagreement and a screw job that returned the gold to amassed fabulous moolah. I'm sure another screw job video will find its way into this series at some point. Ultimately, WrestleMania still had to stand up as something resembling a thoroughbred wrestling show. Unlike all staple wrestling classics, the main event needed to deliver. Hogan and T versus Piper and Orndorff was always going to be the match that made or broke WrestleMania. Despite the aforementioned backstage drama between some of the combatants, and the multiple moving parts thanks to involvement from cornermen Jimmy Snuka and Bob Orton, the match itself was a wild, chaotic brawl that set the world's most famous arena on fire. It fell into the mate category then, not break. Muhammad Ali served as a special guest enforcer, with Liberace and the Rockettes adding to the glitz beforehand. The babyfaces won, and the event ended on a high note, with the heroes victorious and the crowd ecstatic. The numbers came in, and WrestleMania was an enormous financial success. WWE had survived and thrived, and a long path to monolithic supremacy had been paved. But what was the legacy of the gamble? Well, the official WWE narrative treats WrestleMania 1 as a destiny fulfilled. In truth, it was a near-death experience for the company. The financial risks were astronomical, the potential pitfalls were everywhere, and Vince McMahon's dream of wrestling as mainstream entertainment could have ended in disaster. Instead, WrestleMania became the foundation for WWE's empire. But the lesson of the first is clear. WWE's biggest successes have often come from its biggest risks, regardless of the damage they may inflict on other aspects of the industry. In another universe, WrestleMania flops, the company just collapses, and wrestling remains a fragmented regional business. History remembers the winners, of course, but before WrestleMania 1, it almost lost everything. And while the inaugural event proved to be a landmark achievement, not every edition of the event would be an unqualified success. The following years saw varying degrees of triumph and failure, both creatively and financially. WrestleMania 2 was an ambitious but flawed attempt to scale up the brand's reach by broadcasting from 3 separate locations. Though the New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles destinations succeeded in adding grandeur to the show, the concept made for a disjointed viewing experience, with dead crowds and weak, abbreviated in-ring action in some arenas. WrestleMania 3, however, was a defining moment. Held in the Pontiac Silverdome in front of a contested but nonetheless massive announced attendance of 93,173 fans, it set a new standard for wrestling as a North American major stadium event. Hulk Hogan's body slam of Andre the Giant became one of the most iconic moments in wrestling history, and the show was both a critical and commercial triumph. This event right here solidified WrestleMania as wrestling's Super Bowl. However, the hype then became a bit harder to harness. WrestleMania 4 struggled under the weight of its tournament format. While it had historical importance, its real success was in how it kickstarted the story that made WrestleMania 5 another financial hit. The reliance on the long-building feud between Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage overshadowed an otherwise average undercard, and the 1990s brought a similar mix of high points and missteps. WrestleMania 6 saw the landmark passing of the torch moment between Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior, but it hid the commercial iceberg that was on the horizon. WrestleMania 7 was advertised for the Los Angeles Coliseum in order for the company to break 100,000 sold. But the opposite was true of WWE's business, and the event was moved to the arena next door amidst a line about Sergeant Slaughter's pro-Iraq gimmick apparently being a security threat in an open-air setting. WrestleMania 8 looked visually like the bloom had never left the rose, but it proved to be the final bow of the company's golden era. The talent turnover between the Hoosier Dome and the Caesars Palace car park was best displayed by the visual disparity between the two shows. And when the company returned home to Madison Square Garden 10 years on from WrestleMania 1, well, the vibes couldn't have been more different. Vince McMahon crowned Bret Hart WWE Champion for a second time at Mania 10, but it was the first time that Vince McMahon categorically went with the Hitman as his post-Hulkamania guy after a debacle that saw Hogan politic his way to a 5th title reign at the Show of Shows the prior year. We've ranted about that enough on these videos. It was the same night Shawn Michaels leapt forward as a next top guy thanks to the instantly iconic Intercontinental Championship ladder match with Razor Ramon. And those two were definitely key in maintaining core audiences in the lean years ahead. WrestleMania 11 in 1995 showed the company's creative and financial struggles in full view, headlined as it was by a celebrity match between NFL star Lawrence Taylor and Bam 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 Bigelow that lacked the true crossover magic of the original celebrity-heavy era, and felt more like a desperate attempt to regain mainstream attention rather than own a spotlight already shone upon it. Hart and Michaels took center stage for an hour the following year, but in retrospectively making and launching Stone Cold Steve Austin in 1998, the two were able to be as integral to the company's commercial salvation as they were all the critical acclaim. Now, there have been more words donated to the Attitude Era than any other, let's be honest. But the explosion of the Rattlesnake proved to be the rising tide that just raised all the ships up they were coming. The WWE sky was full of stars once again, and a lot of beer now too. And after 2 more WrestleManias in arenas, the company arrived back in the stadium for 2001's X7. A still critically lauded show that nonetheless was rapidly revised as the boom's beginning of the end. After mixing the vibe in the intervening years, WWE then made the permanent decision to hold every single WrestleMania in a stadium, beginning with WrestleMania 23 at Ford Field in Detroit. This call was a declaration that the event was no longer just the company's biggest event. It was a global spectacle, bigger not just than the world it inhabited, but indeed the one we all did. It was a PR swing on par with the decision to go with the original WrestleMania, and yet another one that initially paid insane dividends. Larger crowds meant more ticket sales, and the grandeur of guaranteed stadiums and host cities made the event feel even more special. Production values skyrocketed with elaborate stage designs, bring back the damn roller coaster, massive LED screens, and pyrotechnics budgets that topped pretty much anything else in the company calendar. However, this shift also came with an unintended downside. By increasing the scale of WrestleMania's presentation, WWE was also magnifying its creative missteps on the biggest stage possible. As the grandest stage continued to grow in scale, the quality of storytelling direction under the worst of Vince McMahon autocracy continued to decline. Raw and SmackDown as television entities had become inconsistent, let's put it that way, plagued by repetitive feuds, endless questionable booking decisions, and a reliance on part-time wrestlers at the expense of full-time talent. Yep, it was a dark time. This issue became glaringly apparent in events like WrestleMania 32 in 2016, which, despite being held in front of a then record heavily worked 101,763 fans at AT&T Stadium in Texas, was widely criticized for its marathon runtime and unsatisfying booking. Roman Reigns' coronation as the new top babyface fell flat with the crowd, who rejected him as the company's latest Hulk Hogan-like figure. And the card exposed the market leader's struggles with pacing and match placement, making the spectacle feel exhausting rather than exhilarating. By WrestleMania 34 in 2018, WWE's booking problems were just impossible to ignore. The show featured a match between Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns that was meant to cement the big dog as the face of the present and future. But the crowd just vocally rejected it and hijacked the match with chants of "This is awful" and CM Punk. They all knew that his WWE return was just 5 years away and wanted to let us know, you see. Meanwhile, WrestleMania 35 in 2019 suffered from a bloated runtime of over 7 hours. 7! Making it the longest WrestleMania ever and causing damaging fatigue by the time the historic first ever women's main event hit the ring. I'm pretty sure I nodded off, so sorry Becky, Charlotte and Ronda, but I've watched it since. Reality bit in 2020, but oddly enough, it left a mark that once again took the show from death's door back to the promised land. As the world locked down due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Vince McMahon just stubbornly insisted on running the event in Raymond James Stadium in Tampa until he legally couldn't. It eventually went down in an empty performance center spread over 2 nights. And while it was initially WWE making the best of a bad situation, the universal response to the move was to just keep it that way when crowds eventually came back. The decision exponentially improved the pacing of these shows, and it made it easier to showcase more talents without exhausting the audience. So yeah, good stuff all around. Two-nighters meant two main events too, freeing up, for example, Stone Cold Steve Austin to headline a WrestleMania on the same weekend as Roman Reigns, despite the two having nothing canonically to do with one another. However, the core issue of WWE's creative struggles remained until the summer after that specific event. Vince McMahon resigning in disgrace in July 2022 made 2023's card look like the first without his fingerprints, until it was revealed that he was at the heart of a coup back into the fold in order to drive forward a merger with UFC under the TKO umbrella the day after WrestleMania 39. So much for that then. His second disgraced resignation in 2024 was the true tipping point. And WrestleMania 40, with its constant references to new eras and bold and decisive crowning of Cody Rhodes as the company's undisputed top star, allowed Paul Levesque to claim the creative throne from his father-in-law, while more power players in power suits did the rest. The rest, as of right now, is, well, unknown really. WrestleMania 41 from Las Vegas, Nevada will draw the company's two biggest gates in history. But that's as much down to aggressive price hikes as how hot the product is. I'm sure they can't wait to tell us all about that next record being broken. Yay, thanks for giving us all your money. The product is on fire, as Triple H has enjoyed parroting on the road to the latest show of shows. But once again, as it was in 1985, WrestleMania remains the constant acid test. Look, a card seemingly made up of compromises in order to accommodate the massive slate of stars is not going to determine the financial future of WWE in the way it might have done before. WrestleMania cannot kill WWE now because just about nothing can or ever will, folks. But the worst thing to do with a hot hand is crash and burn, and as with WrestleMania 4, WrestleMania 8, WrestleMania X7, and half of the events in the 2010s, sometimes even the biggest stage only does so good a job of obscuring lots of tiny problems. The gambles have ostensibly never been smaller, but the more things change, well, the more they stay the same. With WrestleMania, my friends, the stakes will always be sky high. Have you enjoyed this How WrestleMania Almost Killed WWE video based on the fantastic article written by the great Michael Hamflett? Then why not tap on this awesome 100 greatest WWE WrestleMania moments list as well? Because it's just as good, it's just as big, you're gonna love it. Go tap on it and thank me later. Bye bye.